I've always believed that everyone has a story and that everyone's story has value. I'm Joanna Pena-Bickley, the host of Designed By, a new Designed By Us documentary series that recognizes the changemakers, imagineers, and inventors in STEAMed science, technology, engineering, arts, math, and design. As I have traveled the globe and collaborated with some of the world's leading scientists, artists, and mathematicians, I know that daring to design the future today all begins with a vision and a narrative of a hopeful future. I invite you to join us on a journey of discovery, finding the voices and magic makers, changing the very shape of our future. When I think about Amanda, I think of her as the Queen Kamehameha of all things design when it comes to like the intersection of fashion, design, and tech. Amanda, you've had such a remarkable career, and so much of that career has had this really interesting interchange between technology, human factors, and fashion. It's so very rare that you meet someone who's actually had a responsibility for bringing those things together. One of the things that I would love to explore is, where did you come from? Because great creators like you don't come out of anywhere. They're usually made over time. And then I think some of the second things is really about, what are the things that you've learned on this journey?
Thank you. And first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I feel truly honored. I love everything that you're doing with this organization and could not be more excited and supportive to be here and to share my story and hopefully share a lot of more with others as we go down this path. So yeah, I've had, I guess, a bit of an unconventional career, but in hindsight, it makes perfect sense, of course. But I do think that, a lot of it that I am now working, combining fashion and material science and technology and engineering, came from a lot of things that were always present in my personality and what I cared about. And it was sort of just about chasing them down, sometimes not really knowing exactly where they were going to lead or if I was making a good decision. But really there was quite a bit of kind of trusting your gut in a lot of those situations. But I think, if you I grew up in Southern California in Redondo Beach in a cute little surf town. What probably a lot of people don't know about me is that my parents are Northern Irish, and they were very much part of an immigrant class coming over, kind of a strange immigrant class, the sort of white immigrants. But they were from Northern Ireland at a time of trouble, and my dad left when he was 18 and went to Africa. I was actually supposed to be born in Africa. They were going to settle there. My mom was in nursing school and my dad was building villages. Anyways, so they ended up leaving Africa for various other tumultuous reasons and went to Canada and then ended up in California. So it was, I definitely feel of various cultures, even though they might, I might not look like like a mixed culture, but Northern Ireland is definitely a world away from LA. I think I always kind of had a bit of all those things. However they were coming through. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember being like 6 or 7, and I've always been very obsessed with color and very sensitive to it, like highly, highly sensitive to it. And I used to drive my mother crazy, where I'd go for 9 months to a year where I would only wear one specific shade of yellow, and then I would switch it into purple, or I was very had a highly attuned and obsessive aesthetic sense as a kid. But I was also just like a kid who was pretty good at math and stuff, and actually really liked it in a way that I think I was lucky, because my parents were incredibly supportive, and they ended up, I was in public school until I was 11 or 12, and then managed to get into the private school on full scholarship. And so I just had an incredibly supportive time from that period on. But I do remember a time in 5th and 6th grade where it was, people told me afterwards, but it was oh, she could go one way or the other. You got to get her some stimulus or else she's going to, start rebelling or something, right? Being bored is a very dangerous thing to a 10 or 11-year-old.
That's fantastic. I certainly can, I can relate. When do you feel like you knew that you were an inventor?
I think, and this is such an LA story, is I remember the first time I found out that there was this job at Disneyland called being an Imagineer, and that there was somebody whose job it was to invent all the rides and all the mechanisms and like design Toontown. I was like, I think that was like the closest I'd ever come to a job that was both creative and technical in my world. And I just kind of knew. And I think, I love building things and painting things. And, my dad was, had done a lot of construction and furniture building. So I knew that all that stuff was there, but I didn't really know that there was there were jobs that did these things.
But what's interesting to me, and I've heard this from a number of inventors, designers, and technologists, particularly in the invention space, right? Which is, I didn't know someone would pay me to do that.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a piece of that. I'm not sure I was that cognizant of that at the time, but I think it was more the realization that, yeah, this stuff didn't come out of nowhere. Like somebody had to make it and somebody did it, and there's a job behind that. I think there's something kind of fascinating about that part of the world when kids start to understand like all the things that are in place in the world have been built by someone.
Absolutely. So when you think about it from that, journey from your kid, and then you get to school, tell me a little bit about what was that first selection like?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was really lucky like I said, from 7th grade on, I got into this amazing private school, and we had this really cool crew of neighborhood friends. They were actually all immigrants. So there was a couple that was Armenian, Iranian, German, Canadian, just like a lovely mix of core friends. We're still super good friends, all of us, and all the families had like 2 daughters within 2 years of each other. It was kind of like just really kind of magical in the sense when I think about it now. But I ended up being able to go into this private school with them, and this was, while it was a very elite LA private school, it was also very liberal and progressive. There was a lot of kind of value system there that was about just kind of creativity and independence, wherever that was coming from. And also, I think the school I loved high school, which is a really, like, people don't say that, at least not out loud. And I also I was super happy in high school. Like, I had great friends. I was the homecoming princess. I had the cute boyfriend, like all that stuff. But I also had incredible stimulus intellectually. And I was really a giant nerd. I remember taking voluntary math tests at lunch, and I don't know. I think that there was just a bit of a fluidity there where I didn't have to choose so much which person I needed to be. It was a small school, and it was kind of cool to be smart, I guess, which I do know how incredibly rare that is. But so I think that there was a lot of just openness there, and but there was also at the same point like a really incredible amount of pressure about getting into college and all the stuff that I think everybody feels. And and then at Stanford I discovered product design, which is now the D school, the Stanford D school, which is of course really well known in the space. And I was again exceptionally lucky to have David Kelly as my original advisor. Like, met him when I was a freshman, but I do fully understand that feeling of just that helplessness of like, you're working so hard to get somewhere and then it can all be sort of taken away or whatever, because of in retrospect a very small financial thing, but at the time the thing that entirely governs your life. Got through, then was doing all the mechanical engineering coursework, et cetera, and about halfway through I started to realize that they're teaching us so much about how to build, engineer, lab, code, bits of everything. And there wasn't enough to me. I was thinking, I don't know what else has been built. I don't know why we're building this, or, I'm not sure I was articulating quite that way, but I'd always loved art and, design and everything. And I'd been taking some art history class on the side, and I kind of started taking more and more in any kind of design history class I could take, and trying to understand, the history of engineering. It's not exact, because engineers don't have time to learn all of that really. And so it's taught as a form of history, but not as engineering history. So I started kind of doing that as much as I could. And I ended up double majoring in art history, which the school was not happy with. I had to fight them pretty hard on that. But I felt very kind of fulfilled in that way, to that, okay, now I'm having a little bit more about understanding on both sides of the aisle. And I wrote my senior honors thesis for art history about the Memphis movement, which was 1980s design. I'm not even sure I knew exactly what I was writing at the time and how much it was sort of inspiring me further. But I remember at the time, my sort of advisor was like, this is really, really new. And I think that it was because I wasn't thinking like an art historian. I was thinking like what do engineers need to know about the history of why things are built and what is built and why they look the way they're built. There is an aesthetic part of it that determines our behavior and determines our kind of models of the world. That's how things kind of got started. And then, and this was, this was in the dot-com boom, where like Stanford was kind of just, you could just come out and just basically print money, those kinds of early jobs at Google and Yahoo and that kind of thing. So I do remember feeling like I didn't really belong in my major, but I also remember feeling like when we got out, I'm trying to put this tactfully, people who were not that talented or qualified, we're getting really crazy jobs. And I was like, what is up with the world? So I ended up applying for various things, and I got a Guggenheim fellowship, which was way harder than getting all those other things, and went to Italy to go work at the Guggenheim in Venice. I basically fled Silicon Valley at the height of the first wave because I just didn't feel comfortable being there. I don't know. I mean, I still am sort of coming to terms with all of how that manifested itself in me. That's where things went. And then I ended up working in the art world. In Italy, I ended up staying at the museum for almost a year, and then ran the American Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, stayed in Venice, and then moved to Italy and was working in some galleries, and then made my way back into engineering through the Science Museum, where I started working as a exhibit developer, as well as a kind of like an exhibition analyst, which is kind of like an anthropological position, which was super interesting. You find out crazy things when you watch people use exhibits. So yeah. And then from there, ended up back in San Francisco for what was absolutely a dream job at the Exploratorium. So designing exhibits there, which is, the original art, science, and human perception. And my job was everything from come up with exhibit concepts, working with all the, PhD scientists. And I was specifically working directly with a neuroscientist on a seeing and visual perception collection, and then design it, code it, build it, solder weld the table. Like, you were just doing everything. Yeah. So that's a good place to be when you're 24. So anyways, but that's,
you look back then, and I say then, it
yeah.
wasn't like we're old ladies now. We're in our prime, right? We're talking
yeah.
10, 15 years, maybe
Yeah.
20 years at most ago.
Yeah.
Were these a man telling you have everything to use your assets, right?
And I don't, to be fair, I don't know if they use those words, but it was like,
but that was,
hey,
I think that was the message.
how to get this done. Yeah. Well, let's brainstorm how to get this done. Like, let's solve this problem. Right. And that's, and you can't, it's hard to sort of deny or be sort of outraged at this idea when people are trying to help you in this way. So so those are the things I find to sort of complicate my head about all this stuff. But I think the one thing that was interesting is I ended up with some really close friends that were grad students at the time that were male, and I'm still friends with, and that I think kind of took me under their wing. I almost knew no female grad students. I mean, there were very few, but it's funny. reconnected with some of them now, and I think they were like, why didn't we know each other better? That was a weird thing too, which was like, it's not that we were like, put against each other or any weird thing. I just think that there's a bit more of a like, hey, women should kind of stick together or whatever, just kind of be aware of each other in a way. I don't remember that much. That feeling that, but I do feel like I got very lucky with a couple of male friends that turned into mentors that were that really they kind of took care of me. They looked out for me, in a bit of a way. I think they kind of, so that was
Gotcha. So you touched on something that I think is so, I always looked at the things that you made, even in the early days. I've been trying to make a certain couple of things since the time I was 7, right? And you do this over time, and you don't realize, I certainly didn't realize it then, I realize it now, but I would love to kind of dive deep into, you happen to bring up the stiletto,
yeah,
right?
sure.
And I look at our inventions as, as babies, because they become ideas that grow over time, right? They're this germination of something that you see and you tried 3 or 4 different ways and maybe in iterations, and you call it different things, but inevitably you're still working on that thing, right?
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about why the shoe.
Well, okay. I mean, I think this is actually a really interesting point from a psychological place, because I didn't really ever intend to work on this shoe right. So I loved shoes, as everybody who's ever met me knows. I think I've always thought of them as sort of like just this perfect hybrid of, feats of engineering. They need to be structural, they need to be soft, they need to be hard, they need to be beautiful, they need to operate, all these things. And they're also kind of mysterious, like in how they're made. I mean, not to me anymore, but I do still. Shoe manufacturing is fascinating, like the machines that go into it. Anyways, so I'd been super just kind of in love with them, but I think there is this piece that comes from being a very serious engineer, in the sense that, like, okay, I have a Stanford mechanical engineering degree. I'm a serious engineer. Serious engineers don't make shoes, right? And this is something that a little bit, my mom still to this day is like, you have a PhD from MIT. Why do you work in fashion? Like, there's this kind of just this mental model of like, that's not important engineering, right? And so I think there was still that kind of bouncing around in my head. I mean, I'd gone off, I was working on these science exhibits, which I loved to death. And then I, came after I left the exploratorium. Well, I got into MIT when I was still at the exploratorium, mostly because I was not trying to necessarily go to grad school, but I met my advisor, and who wrote She Ishi, who's a huge mentor and hero of mine, who was working on what he had named tangible media, which is physical digital interactivity. At the time, it was, how do we actually like fuse the two worlds? So now it's the IoT, a million other things, but he wrote the original paper for this in 1997. And so we just clicked, and in the strangest of ways, because he's like this crazy, fiery Japanese man. He's tiny. He's, like, people are terrified of him. And like, we're really good friends now. I mean, we've had our whole series of battles, but we always understood each other in some kind of, I think, some very basic way about what we wanted to get done. And one of the things that I really loved about him was when, he would have a million people come interview to be in our lab. And this is, I mean, it's again, one of those crazy things where it's like, yeah, I got really, really lucky. But then it's about, okay, so what's the mental model where people would show up and try to impress him with how good they were at coding or electronics or whatever. And I was just like, I got these ideas that here I can't make them. And here's how I'm thinking about all these bigger problems in the world about science communication, about education, about, like neuroscience, whatever. And he wants, as I think is a really good responsible model for academics, he was looking for people who knew how to think, right? He's like, we can get lots of other undergrads and people around us to, make that happen, make that happen. This is like teaching someone how to be a leader. And so if he saw that you could, knew how to think, you could stand up for your ideas and talk about them in a way that was cohesive and had a plan, that was a thing. Anyway, so the point was, when I got to MIT, I was working in this group that was all about, physical digital computing, and yet everything in the entire group and was made of metal, wood, or plastic. So there's no texture, there's no softness, and the group at that point had 1 to 2 women in its history, as they'd been around for about 15 years. I am still I was the first woman that made it all the way through the master's and PhD there. There's been a few more since, luckily. This is not specifically saying anything about my advisor. I mean, yeah, it's a rough place, and it's a whole other kind of level of stories there. But there is something to be said that if nobody in the entire lab knows anything about textiles or knows how to use a sewing machine, you're not going to end up with a whole lot of like textile interfaces, right? And it's a stereotype that has like absolutely been 100%, supported with evidence, in the sense that I used to, we had this crazy, amazing machine shop at MIT in the media lab, and they're mill, like 4D mill, everything CNC controlled, also had fantastic sewing machines and embroidery machines that never got touched. And I used to run like workshops to teach all these incredible engineers how to sew. And I remember so clearly the number of times that they would be like, oh my God, there's a second thread in the bottom of the machine. It's like, yeah, that's how it makes a knot. And like, I mean, these are brilliant, brilliant engineers. And so, those are the kinds of things where I was like, it really does matter that I'm here. Those kinds of stories. Anyway, so getting to the shoe, I did start working on some fashion projects. My advisor was not at all into this. He was fighting me the whole way, and we've since come to peace with it. And he's been very, very thankful and supportive of the influence that I did have over the group, just by me just fighting with him about stuff, basically. And I was determined. I ended up like curating and producing these runway shows in my free time, that were like, it was kind of secret, and then they ended up blowing up, and we had the fire department got called into the media lab basement because we were having a runway show of wearable tech. We had a piece of AstroTurf. We had an AstroTurf runway. I'm not kidding. We got $500 from the MIT Arts Council. We had an AstroTurf runway, and the building was shut down because so many people showed up. I mean, this was like, people cared, and it was fun, and it was stuff that I still hear people go, wouldn't it be amazing if this? And I was like, you should definitely look at this project from 2006, like for real. And it was like, we didn't have Arduino fully functioning at this point, and somebody built that, right? So that kind of stuff, that was like, I do love this stuff, and I care, and I knew what I was doing. And so I did end up building a bunch of shoes there. But again, I think it was like, this is my side project. My real thesis is about actual robotics, right? Actual, like the real mechanical interactivity. I did end up working at the end on a lot of material behavior, textiles. Like I did push it into the direction, but 6.5, 7 years, it took me, I was at MIT for that long, and it took me a really long time to get there. So I think that's the first form of anything that you should obviously follow. Like, I did like bits and pieces of my dissertation I absolutely love, but I probably just should have been making shoes. Anyways, no, not really, but because then I would have been too sick of it to actually work on afterwards. But the point being that after I got out of MIT, I started this other algae biofuels company, and we can talk about that in a minute, but I didn't go straight into this. But what is interesting is that so the founder of the shoe company, who was she was actually like the head of recruiting for SpaceX. So she was very much a kind of HR business type person. And she was also obsessed with shoes, and she had come to this idea of like, oh, why do I work in a company where everyone around me makes the best robots in the world, and I'm walking across these factory floors in agony in these high heels? And started asking the engineers around her, like why do my shoes hurt so much? And none of them had any idea how shoes are made. And she's like, that's an issue. Anyway, so what I think is interesting is that obviously I knew that this was a huge problem. I was just like, oh, that's not serious. And there's something in the back of my head that wasn't like, let me start this shoe project. So she found me, ironically, through one of my Stanford mentors, who was like, oh, do you know anybody who, knows about shoe engineering? And he was like, yes, I do. I know exactly the person. So I think it needed to be brought back to me in a way that she was like, I've got like an astronaut and a bunch of like aerospace engineers willing to work on it, but they don't know anything about how shoes are made or whatever. So I remember really specifically in the early days of that, like going through with them and teaching them about the difference between a stiletto and a pump and and a wedge. And then, when you crack open like regular shoes up and down the chain, like lowest to all the way up to Louboutins, there's this crazy metal shank in the middle that is the same. It's literally a medieval piece of technology. It's like a forged piece of steel. And they're like, what is this doing in here? And the rest of this is cardboard. Like, doesn't make any sense. What their minds were just like blown that this is inside of this beautiful, incredible object. And I was like, no one's ever touched it. Like, not since this was like as advanced as we got, like when the Stiletto was born. And I was like, oh yeah. And I've been working with a guy who is like the grandson of the guy who invented the first stiletto. Like I was like deep into like Northern Italy, all this stuff, right? Through Sergio. And it was just, they were just like mystified that they're like, this is just an open engineering problem. And I was like, yeah, there's a lot of these that are, I think, women centric or whatever. So they were like, let's do it. They're like, but how are we ever going to test it? Right. That was also the funny thing where I was like, okay, well, great. I can design and test this thing. Anyways, not that, you can't make stiletto. We, make shoes in men's sizes, but anyway, so the stiletto thing, I think one of the biggest points for me was that it was to like, the lesson learned was, okay, all those ideas that have been like percolating in your head that maybe at the time didn't seem serious, were they not serious just because they were girly? Like were you trained to not take them seriously because they were like women's problems? Or like, and now I just am like retraining my brain to think about them as opportunities that have been under evaluated because men don't experience them. But that was one of the things that it had to.
That to me, I'd love to let's dive deep into that, because I think that's an interesting space, right? Was it because they simply didn't see the world from our point of view, or like, are these the new opportunity spaces, right? Because clearly men have been creating products, and I think about this even in like feminine products, like douche and tampons and pads, like for whatever reason, or bras. Let's start there, right? Brassieres, things like that, right? Not just things we wear in our body or on our body, that are incredibly intimate. But why wasn't it taken seriously? I think that's a really important question to examine.
So I think, first of all of these are, all the guys that I was working with on this are incredibly good engineers and are, not at all sexist in any way. And the thing was that they had literally never thought about it. Like, it had not crossed their mind. And even if you talk to, and this makes me really angry, is like male shoe designers, they try to tell you that women don't care about how the shoes feel. It's like a thing to wear it because it's painful, and that's like part of the thing, and blah blah blah. And there's nothing to be done about, right? It's like there's a weird like masochistic status symbol thing there. And I was like, okay, I have very little respect for your opinion on that. Because no one is asked, if you were being asked to walk around in these, like, you're designing them and you don't care how they fit or feel at all. Like that, they would say that directly to me. And they're like, they'd be like, there's no market for this because women don't care. And I was like, you probably do know like 3 women like that who are your main customers, but let's like, let's be a little more realistic. So no, absolutely. I think they're massive opportunity spaces. And I think we're starting to see that, my God, like so much now, like across, just every product, bra, Third Love, Spanx. I mean, look at all the things that are massively successful in this realm. So I think that the thing about the stiletto thing that's very different and interesting is it is incredibly akin to problems like bridges and rockets in terms of like structures and load balancing and all these force dynamics and stuff that which was actually exactly the right match to work with SpaceX people and aeronautics. And that's why I think it was so interesting. I already knew Sergio, who was a former aerospace engineer, who is now this head shoe research in London. And then then the SpaceX thing came to me after that, and I brought Sergio and those guys together. So but no, that you're totally right that there's this like what's that quote, there's a lot of money to be made from taking women seriously, and but it's also about like us taking ourselves seriously, but I think even as we move through the process with the stilettos, raising money is a whole other thing. Like we had all the engineers on board and fully convinced, and actually almost everybody in our seed round was just like guys from SpaceX. I'm not kidding. They were just like super, they're like, yes, we want in on this. This is like an untapped opportunity problem, right? But then when you get into the traditional VC market where, they're like, oh, the typical thing where I'm sure you've been, oh, okay, I should ask my wife about this. And that, let me, like, they can't test it. Like, I don't blame them entirely, but like, they don't know how to test it. They're unable to test it. And then they're not really sure how to like research it. And so it's just kind of like an uncomfortable space. It's also like a consumer product, it's not like a pure scientific research point of view. So there's a lot of things going on there where, and then you're a bunch of female founders, like, all the things are stacking up. Female founders with a female problem walking into regular investment rooms is hideous. I mean, I would take the engineers any day over investment guys. And we can maybe switch to that conversation in a bit. But I think there's a lot more sexism and probably racism in money circles than there is in engineering, because there's something to be said about meritocracy within engineering. It's not entirely true, but there is something to be said about that being true. Like when you're really, really good at something, people don't care. Not,
yeah, that certainly has, no, absolutely. That's been my experience completely. I was, for good or for bad, throughout my career, I was one of the guys, or at least considered by one of the guys, because I could think as fast and move as fast as they could, and maybe faster in some cases, right?
Yeah.
But
and I mean, my crew in my lab at MIT, like I love those guys to death. They taught me so much. We were all really different, and even they were different from each other. And but we were bonded in kind of like, the way of thinking, the respect of the problem, and just that commitment to it, I guess. I don't know.
So, that's a really interesting insight, because I certainly saw that. I was always a little bit more on the design service, tech services place, and the money people that I was dealing with were often bankers, right? And because you were often having to speak a completely different language to finance, right? It's one thing to be in the lab or to be in the design studio inventing something or trying to get something done. Now to pivot and speak a language that is about keeping the lights on,
Yeah.
that has the human lives that are kind of attached to it. Isn't, here's just what we need for making the product work, right? But this is how we make a payroll. What was that like? Like, how did you make that pivot?
Yeah. So I think actually that's a really good lead in, because so what happened when I was finishing my PhD at MIT was I was taking a bunch of, so the whole time I was at MIT, I was getting more and more obsessed about how things are made, what they're made of, supply chains, like seeing e-waste, just being disturbed by so many things and realizing that there's data that can bring us more information on this, or why don't companies understand this? Like just a lot of just ideas that we're starting to kind of formulate about, that were in the air and now are of course hugely, important and popular. But, so that was continuously on my mind, and I was taking different courses, et cetera. So taking one course on like sustainable architecture, learning about all different kinds of systems there. And then a really good friend of mine who was an optical engineer, he was working on a technology that was about like flashing light and like micro LEDs for new, like, screens for like, new high definition screens. And I'm still trying to remember exactly how this all came about. Like MIT, it's like a mishmash of work, parties, I don't know what. Anyways, but it turns out that there was this research from NREL from the 70s that was looking at like, so all of the ways that they were trying to look at growing, like, for example, like plants for biofuels or even plants in space and light structures, that you could actually, if you flash lights incredibly quickly, like flash LED at LED, particular kind of LED frequency, you could optimize photosynthesis because you wouldn't oversaturate it by having constant light, but it would still be getting a constant stream. So it was like there was theoretically an optimization frequency that at the time they did not have LEDs that could flash that quickly. They did not have the control structure. And so I was getting a little bit obsessed about algae as a medium. It's like a much longer story, but we kind of came up with this idea of like, let's try this. Like, let's like flash like lights at this really specific rate at algae and see if it, works and grows them faster. And like, neither one of us is a biologist. Like I was working on a bunch of materials tech at the time. So I was doing some stuff with like living organisms and stuff, but I was very much peripherally, and he was an optical engineer. So we like are like, okay, we tried it a little bit, but it was more like, okay, let's theoretically put all this stuff together. And then he's like, how about we enter the MIT 100K? Like he was like, oh, like he'd already graduated and he was like working at a startup, and he's like, I can do this. Like, let's do this. So I was like, okay, I'm in. Another like submarine project, like my like fashion show producing and stuff. I was like, sure. So I remember we wrote this business plan. I had never seen a business plan before I wrote one. Like I remember I was like Googling it and I was like, what's a business plan? So we had to write this application and whatever. I didn't even know what ROI meant. I remember this so specifically. And but I was like, this is the theory of the company, and we're going to build these boxes that can grow, algae at higher rates so they can compete with fuel, right, with biofuel. And, a little bit of math, like base financial math is sort of like science math, right? You grow this much, it costs this much, you get to a point that, right? It's not rocket science, right? So we put this thing in and I was like, okay, whatever. And then we get called back. Anyways, we end up getting to the finals and we don't win the thing because at this point it's still just two of us. And we've been like, it was like the 6 weeks of the world's craziest mini MBA, where we're basically in with all these advisors who are like the most fancy people in finance, right? And they're asking us stuff about our deck. And like, literally, I'm just embarrassing myself, like just hand over fist, like they're using all the acronyms. I'm like, what does that mean? And they're like, what are you guys doing here? Like people are getting angry at us. At one point, someone got angry at me because I wasn't dressed up enough. And I started laughing because I was like, well, we were in like a rehearsal or something. And I was like, oh, dude, you have no idea what I'm gonna look like at the presentation. Like he was like, it's kind of disrespectful that you blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I came here from the lab. Like what, anyways. So I was like, if that's what you really are caring about, so that was, I remember that very specifically, or I was like, just wait for my outfit. So anyways, we then accidentally started this company. So when you get to the finals, we were in the final 5 teams. We got some money, we got legal support, we got a full network, whatever. We were doing this, and I had to still graduate. So we got another partner to help, whatever. And we started building these things. And I think that was my sort of introduction to entrepreneurship. It's funny because I could have done, I think, all of this straight out of Stanford if I wasn't kind of thinking that, I didn't belong in this world, right? I kind of almost had to get dragged into it. I was at such a high level of tech at that point. Like I had to get basically all the way through 11 years of engineering school to feel like, oh, maybe I could belong here and do this, right? Which is like why when I look at like 23-year-old boys in Silicon Valley being so, obnoxiously confident, I can't deal. But there, yeah, so that was the kind of transition into like, how do we make this work? And it was, a very obviously a difficult financial model. Anything that is trying to compete with the fossil fuel industry. I did not know this at the time, but the amount that I learned from that is like, what were we thinking? But we patented the thing. We managed to license it. There's whole chunks of the technology that is still incredibly viable. I mean, we got money. We raised some money. We got a whole bunch of small business innovation research grants from the government. We got we had a really great run, and in the end, it was just that everybody was getting different jobs and going different places, and then we were also kind of we managed to do all that in 2009-10 when there was no money to be raised, and then I think we all just were like just kind of wanted different things, but we did do some licensing with. I learned so much about carbon credit. I mean, everything I know about biotech and what I do now, and carbon and all the importance about materiality, everything I know about algae. I mean, I now make seaweed t-shirts. Guess what? We use the part of the seaweed that we weren't trying to harvest. This was a waste product that I was like, we should do something with that waste product after we take this oil. So it all kind of ties back. But that's the point where I don't know if that's a true transition to product story, because it wasn't like we scaled up manufacturing. But I did have some crazy experiences where we were moving into a field like you think about the world's oldest boys club network, like old school oil guys, like energy, and just the stuff that got flung at me as a woman in the space, and being super young and all the stuff that was probably like the brutalest of the brutal. So yeah.
So you have had such a tenured career. I mean, you've done everything from the shoe to algae, right? And back again. What would you say were some of your the creations or the inventions that you were most proud of?
Yeah. I mean, those are two of them. I think for sure the algae thing, because the amount of learning that went into that and the amount of places I had to go that were kind of deeply uncomfortable and unknown, and just kind of like plod forward with like no money, no security net. Like it wasn't even, we weren't really still in school, just kind of like, what in the world are we doing? But I was genuinely excited about it. And, and like one of the reasons that I actually did it was because I was so in love with the color spectrum of the algae. And I had made a Pantone chart that mapped out like the days of growth that I was determined to make like a display where I used the day of growth. I could control the color based on like food and sunlight and all this. So I had like a whole like kind of deeper passion about like, how do we start to I'm going to say control nature when I don't want to say control, but I think augment and understand. And that was like a huge transitioning point for me and my sort of way of thinking about the world and everything that I now care about so much about the bioeconomy and our kind of return to biomass. So I'm very proud of that, just kind of like as a kind of movement. And then I'm also kind of, I'm proud of the way that I pushed my advisor and my lab forward into textiles, fashion, the body, the consideration of the body around, we're talking about physical digital interactivity, and that just had not been considered in any real way. And so just that very notion of like what I used to call computational materiality, which was the basis of my thesis, was, like just trying to like open people's minds about that, I think is maybe something I'm kind of proud about.
Absolutely.
I'm
So
not going to say
you know what,
anything
let's
good
go
for this
back for a
project.
second. Maybe what we go back into is, you started with this brilliant idea about rethinking the stiletto, right? What were some of the sacrifices that you had to make when you took it to market?
Okay, so well, first of all, it wasn't like fully my idea to make this product. Like, I just want to be clear that like, oh my God, like the team and everybody was on it, and the founder, I thought about the problem in a million different ways, but there was, so already when I came to the thing, there was some work on it that had already been done. And, I think that, first of all, I don't think that I've ever made anything entirely alone, which I think is like super important point. And I think that is, I consider that to be a hugely successful thing about my career, and not like, I don't, some people might say, the ego in people of like, who's the founder, who's the this, or who, what, and I'm like, that is not how real design and collaboration work, or, just kind of, that's not how the creative process works. And so I think that it's just sort of important to point that out. But when you're getting like truly into it, I think that the first thing is that you're basically working on, you have a business structural problem, in the sense that you are working on what is basically a biotech solution, like a pretty hardcore engineering research that needs, like, say, if you like, the kind of work that goes into making an exoskeleton, right? You're trying to do that to a commercial product. So you need way, way more money and testing and manufacturing money and time and everything than any, investor in what you would consider a traditional fashion brand wants to give you. So you're up against a structural business problem, right? So how do you solve that? You're also up against, like with any new form of technology, and I talk about this a lot in my current company, the research starts expensive and then it will then trickle down to being cheaper. And how can you start, like, what is the business model around creating that, right? So in certain ways, there's no, like, we had to, the entire structure of the shoe industry was based on people buying these off the shelf shanks for, a few cents. And we were trying to basically recreate that part, putting, tens of thousands or $100,000 into molds, fully new materials that were patented. The structure was patented, everything, doing tests with biomechanical engineers and doctors, and running it like a true kind of science study. And so you're kind of up against, how does that ever work out into, like, in the same way that a drug would, and like, oh, well, eventually over time it pays for itself, right? Those kinds of models. You can't really do that in a consumer product in the same way. So you're up against taking more investment up front. So I think part of it was that we never did the extent of the modeling, testing, and building that we really wanted to. Like, we got to a place that was much, much better. We got results that were much, much better. We haven't gotten as far as we can go. I know that, right? This is like, we've gotten it so that, like, 60% of, your weight is shifted now to be 60-40 versus 80-20, which quite frankly feels unbelievable when you're wearing the shoes. And so much so that, we've had people who were used to wearing stilettos their entire lives would put them on and feel like they were going to fall over backwards because they were, like, so not used to being balanced and, or in comfort, or they're like, oh, that shooting pain in my toe is gone. Like, what's going on? So all that stuff that's about like, the anatomy of the body, the engineering, all that stuff. So you just have all those. So I think that there was the idea of you're just continuously compromising in a way that as an engineer, you get so sad. And especially when you're working with like engineers who are used to having SpaceX money, right? They're like, what do you mean? Let's just run another blah, blah, blah. And we're like, no, like, and so those two things are kind of up against each other in terms of compromises. And then you also have, the opposing set, which I'm still kind of up against, is like, when you are trying to do things that are better in fashion, people are fine with paying a lot for new electronics because they think they're quote new, right? The newest Apple, the newest laptop, right? That's technology that you feel is new technology. Material technology is a lot harder because a lot of what we're doing is trying to make things that are better for the world, for the earth, makes things that, decompose more quickly, that are made in more efficient processes, that are better, like in terms of they don't use toxic things that the consumer will never see, right? And so it's not so much that you're trying to ask them to pay an astronomical amount, but the value system is much stranger also because you have the branding thing that's sort of overarching it all, where, quite frankly, like super expensive couture, like heels, for example, they're not necessarily that much more expensive to make than cheaper ones. They might have, like slightly better construction and like, but you don't necessarily know that they have better labor practices. There's a lot of them that are the same materials and the same shapes and molds, and there's like a lot of creativity, but there's also like a lot of like just straight up marketing and advertising. The brands are spending money on marketing, advertising, all these things that are not about the product. So when I first got into thinking about couture, I was like, great, there's this giant margin that we can spend on science instead of marketing. Do you know how like popular that idea was? I mean, I do think we're kind of getting there now when we start thinking about, and even literally right now, like this idea that, oh wait, it does matter what people think, whatever. But at the time when I started saying this, I was like, we should definitely start working on high science for couture because like, there's just they really are, the margins are kind of crazy, but that's just for a tiny, tiny percentage of the products. And for most of the other products in the world, the margins are so slim. And to be honest, the margins are really terrifying for when you go down the chain into the raw material extraction and creation and the manufacturing, right? All those things, you don't have anywhere to work and go, and you're already at a really base bottom line about making sure that you're responsible to the people and humans involved in the work chains and the environmental stuff. So it gets really scary really fast inside of the fashion supply chain. So I think that's there's all those kind of compromises around the product.
What has been the secret to your success? You have gotten to work with like some of the most, I'd say, just well-known designers, couture houses. At least from my perspective, I was like every geek girl's dream, right? You go into a space and it's like, it's about dressing you, right? It is about means. And how did you go about navigating such a connected world, bringing technology into it when it comes to a place of very traditional thinking often?
Yeah, that's super true. I mean, I think I know when people say, "Oh, what's the secret to success?" I'm like, "What?" I don't want to say what success, but I think that this is all very much in progress and things are shifting constantly. I think, on one level, the very same things that maybe kind of stick out and not fit into Stanford at least gives me a little bit more leverage into these spaces. I am girly and I like this stuff, and I do, not nearly as much. It's like I'm the girliest person in like a nerdy engineering school, but I'm the nerdiest person in a fashion house. So so I don't really fit in to any place, but I can kind of hover in a way that isn't quite as, I don't know. So I don't have any giant words of wisdom on that, but I do think that following through on kind of gut instincts and passion about something, and really, if you really know about something and you start talking about, people are they're gonna kind of perk up a little bit, right? It's just, if you that thing about me being so obsessed with the shoe, I couldn't hide it anymore. Right? Or the same way I kind of feel about the bio stuff. I'll just kind of just kind of let into it. But I also think that there's a version around how you kind of address people and the assumptions that you make. So I think trying to assume that you don't know where people are coming from. So maybe this comes from, spending a lot of time in engineering school. You spend a lot of time with people of varying degrees of social, social abilities, right? So there's a lot of brilliant people that are socially inept in various ways, and it's real, that have true disorders around it, and whatever. And I think that I highly appreciate very diverse minds, and kind of have, I think, built up a lot of empathy and appreciation for just kind of where people are coming from when they're thinking about things. And it doesn't always read as patience, but it's I think that idea of kind of deferring judgment a little bit and giving some space there, I think goes a long way. I guess it's a form of humility, but I also think it's a form of anthropological observation in all different kinds of spaces. So for example, people can be really quick to judge fashion people as, flippant, or what, all the stereotypes, in the same way that they're going to judge kind of nerdy tech boys. But there's a lot more going on under the surface that I think is just kind of important to be respectful of. So I don't know if that's that's not a secret or anything, but I just think that that's a way to kind of navigate these spaces. You need to go in there with humility, no matter where you're going in. And then, quite frankly, you can after a while be oh, no, this is totally useless, or whatever. You can start, you start to have judgment, but I think just in terms of giving people the benefit of the doubt, and there's a reason why this is happening, so figure out why this is happening, and then figure out how to go from there. So
thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. I invite you to join us on the next episode as we discover the voices and magic makers changing the very shape of our future by design.